Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Building Healthy, Strong Communities, Session 1, Restorative Practices in Social Work. Before we begin, I want to go over a few housekeeping notes. If you wish to receive CEs for today's webinar, you will need to stay for the duration of the event and respond to all the poll questions you see pop up throughout the presentation. You will see the first poll now. If you do not see the poll pop up, please place your response to the question in the chat. There will be time for Q&A throughout today's presentation. If you have questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. We encourage participation in the chat throughout today's presentation. I am now going to turn it over to Jan Fisher, a member of the School of Social Work's Alumni Board, to introduce today's presenter.
Good morning. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce Barb Hiltz. Barb is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. She's a licensed social worker and also holds a master's in education policy, organization, and leadership with a focus on diversity and equity in education. Her work focuses on the sustainability of community-based organizations, including the role of innovation, social enterprise, and social entrepreneurship in shaping social service delivery. Other areas of her expertise include leadership, human resource management, fund and program development, and fiscal management. For more than 2 decades, Hiltz has worked in interpersonal, community, and administrative practice. Prior to joining the University of Michigan faculty, she served as executive director of a program for men who abuse their domestic partners in St. Louis, Missouri, and a cancer support organization in Ann Arbor. In 2011, she co-founded the Brides Project, a social enterprise designed to raise money for cancer support services. Please welcome Barb Hiltz.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jan, so much. I am going to share my screen, so just give me 1 minute. Let me put up the chat so I can see what you're saying. All right, I will tell you I am notoriously bad at talking and keeping an eye on the chat. So Jan and Madison and Charlotte have all told me that they will help out monitoring the chat. So if you post something and we don't respond to it, just go ahead and post it again and one of us will see it. So as Jan said, my name is Barb Hiltz. I use the pronouns she and her, and I'm faculty here at the School of Social Work, but come from a practice background. And I thought we could talk today about restorative practices and more specifically, how we integrate restorative practices into social work, whether we work in kind of micro or macro settings. And since this is our first session of this conference, I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. The University of Michigan is located in the Huron River watershed on land stewarded by the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires people who are the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. As we work, as we live and learn on these territories, we must keep in mind the ongoing effects of colonization, the community's struggle for self-determination, colonial state violence, and the recognition of Indigenous sovereignty. Through scholarship and through pedagogy, we work to create a future in which the past is thoroughly understood and the present aims to enhance social justice while enacting an ethic of care and compassion. And I included down here a link. It's not a source from this land acknowledgement. It's actually a link where I'm watching the chat and seeing where everyone's coming from, and you're not all located in Michigan. So feel free to go to that link, and while not perfect, it'll give you a sense of the Indigenous people who historically have resided and reside currently in your region. So Madison is going to launch a poll for us. We thought we would start by just getting a sense of who's in the room and the kind of experience that you have. So if you wouldn't mind, just respond to, pick whichever of these phrases you think fits best for you. Either you're quite familiar and have used restorative practices in your work, maybe you know a bit, but not a whole lot, or maybe you have nothing or no experience, full stop, but nothing or no experience in restorative practices. I'm watching the responses come in. And Madison just said in the chat, if you don't see the poll, you can feel free to put your response in the chat, though it looks like we're getting lots of responses. So I'll give you just another second. Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to share the results now. It looks like most of you fall into that middle category, you know, a little bit, but maybe not enough to really integrate it into your work or practice. That's probably why you're here. There are a few people who are quite familiar and have used them, and then a few who really know nothing and are starting from zero. So welcome to you all. If you are someone who has had some experience and have used restorative practices in your career, maybe as I go through the next slide, which is our agenda, you can just type a sentence or two about the experience that you've had and share that with the group. All right, so here is what I was thinking for an agenda. I was thinking we would start with just some grounding on what restorative practices are. So I'll provide a couple of definitions. We'll talk really briefly about the principles on which they sit. And then I want to talk about some specific practices, a couple of practices that we can think of as more preventative in nature, and then some practices that are really more intervention focused. And I've listed a few that we'll talk about today. But really, through all of it, I want to be thinking about how we can apply these to social work settings. So we'll pause at different times and have you give some thought to their uses in social work settings. So hopefully that sounds okay. If there's anything else that you really wanted to cover and you don't see it on this agenda, drop it in the chat and we'll try to get to it. I will tell you that these webinar formats are not my favorite, especially I think because restorative practices are so grounded in relationships and we don't really even get to see each other on a webinar. So let's try to use the chat really as liberally as you feel like you want to. All right, so let's jump in with some definitions about what we're even talking about here. So here's a couple of definitions of what restorative practices are. So the first definition says, restorative practices is an approach that helps people to strengthen relationships, build community, and prevent conflict. And that's from a project in Ireland. The other definition defines restorative practices as a framework for a broad range of restorative practice approaches that proactively build community based on cooperation, mutual understanding, trust and respect, and response to conflict by including all people impacted by a conflict in finding solutions that restore relationships and repair the positive behavior. So besides that last one being a very long sentence, I wonder what stands out to you about these definitions. And if you wouldn't mind, just drop a couple things in the chat. Maybe it's a word that stands out to you or something that you see that they have in common. The focus on relationships, the focus on building community. That they're about prevention and not just sort of a reaction to something, that they're inclusive, community and relationships again. Oh, here comes everything. Now I'm going to miss it all. About repair, including all folks that are impacted, this idea of them being preventative or proactive, lots of people noticing relationships and community. Honestly, that's one of the things that stood out to me too. Yeah, these are great. Mutual understanding, that stood out to me too. Trust and respect. Yeah, fantastic. I'd say that all of that stood out to me too. Certainly this focus on relationships, which really does underpin all restorative practices, really stands out to me. I also like that one of these talks about how it's a framework for a range of practices. It isn't just one thing. And I some of you that have practiced long might agree that it kind of becomes a way of life, like a way of organizing lots of things in your life. It's kind of a collection of practices rather than just one single thing. So restorative practices are used around the world. You can see one of our definitions came from Ireland, but I want to note that in North America, a lot of the practices that we use have roots in Indigenous practices. So I just want to pause there and say a couple things about that. There's a great article that was initially printed in Living Justice Press and I went to find it recently there and it's down, but it's been reprinted on the website of Restorative Solutions. So I put a link to the article here. Madison will share the slides with you after if you want to read it. It's really quite good. And it talks about the origins of restorative practices, especially circles, really having being grounded in Indigenous culture and how they were taught to non-Native people. So I just want to highlight a couple of things. One is that different Native people in North America have used different forms of circles for a millennia. And the circles that we tend to see now tend to be most similar to what are called talking circles, which are often used by folks that live in the Plains region. And this article talks about circles as being more than a technique, but more of a way of life, which I appreciate too. And we just kind of talked about a little bit. I will tell you that I am Canadian, and so this article comes from Canada, and it also talks about how practices were taught to non-Native people through Canada and why. And so it shares that in the 90s, First Nations people in Canada started teaching to non-Native people practices like this in part as a response to the really major mass incarceration that we were seeing and continue to see of Native people in Canada. In fact, I took a look at a statistic from a couple of years ago, and still 32% of people in the prisons in Canada identify as Native people. And so the idea was that returning to Indigenous ways of resolving conflict and harm require collaboration between Native and non-Native people. And so this was one of the reasons that folks felt really strongly about passing on these practices. Restorative practices are also indigenous to several African nations. So for a couple of examples, in Rwanda after the 1994 genocide, they used a process, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Gakaka, which was a restorative practice that had historically been practiced by the Hutu and the Tutsi people. In Ghana, restorative practices were a part of their National Reconciliation Commission in the 2000s. And in other nations like Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Uganda, restorative systems were really widely used before colonization. And these nations are really struggling to try to integrate some of these practices back into their more official legal systems now, but they are still being practiced at a community level. So I say all of this for a couple of reasons. One is I think it's important to note that these are not new practices. And two, I think that when we are working in a way that builds on practices and work that's been done by others, we're standing on the shoulders of others. I think it's really important that we name that. And so that's why I kind of wanted to start there this morning. Howard Zehr wrote a book called The Little Book of Restorative Justice. Maybe some of you have read it. Actually, on my bookshelf here, I've got a series of little books. This is the Little Book of Restorative Justice. It's the kind of book you can put on your nightstand and read in a night, but there's a whole series of little books on different things related to restorative justice that you might be interested in. But in the Little Book of Restorative Justice, Howard Zehr outlines kind of three principles, or they call them pillars to restorative that are really common, right, to restorative practices. The first pillar has to do with needs and harms. So restorative justice would say that what really matters about wrongdoing is the harm that it causes, and harm is really complicated, and it might be to people, but it might also be to communities. Sometimes the harm is to trust. So really paying attention to the harm, but also the need that follows behind, right? I always think of it like a boat, and if the harm is the boat, the needs are kind of the wake that follows behind. So the focus then becomes on identifying and repairing the harm, right, to address those needs rather than punishment. And this is a difference from more traditional systems. I even think of our School of Social Work. We're really trying to integrate more restorative practices into our school, because more traditional approaches really have to do with sort of punishments being handed down from others instead of things being identified and worked on with the people involved. And I'll come to that in just a minute when I talk about engagement. So the second pillar has to do with obligations. So restorative practices would also say where there is harm done, out of that come obligations. And so part of our work when we're facilitating restorative processes has to do with helping people really identify what those obligations could be, and then sorting out, really helping the folks that have caused the harms sort out how they can follow through on those obligations. So we talked about the first two pillars. The third pillar has to do with engagement. So restorative justice promotes the idea of participation. We would say that those who have a stake in what happened are really the right people to be thinking about the creation of any possible solutions or responses. And this again is really different from more traditional punitive systems where the outcome is really handed down. I'm just going to take a quick look in the chat and see, have I missed any questions? Okay, I think we're caught up unless Madison, you see any.
I think you're good, Barb.
Okay, all right. All right, so let's then move into talking about what some of these practices are. So I like to think about restorative practices being used in ways that are more preventative, and then how that really sets a foundation for us to use practices that are maybe more intervention focused. And so today we're going to go through the first two buckets here. So these 5 practices. So let's start with preventative practices. First up is the idea of community building circles. And I think that circles for sure, and maybe community building circles, are often what people think about when they think about restorative practices. So like I said, these community building circles, I think, create a really nice foundation for other practices to be built on, because they do 3 things. They teach some of the basic principles of restorative practice, and they allow people to practice the use of circles and this format at a time where it's really kind of low stress. So there isn't an issue that we're having to resolve. You just get a chance to practice this format. And they allow you to develop or maybe strengthen relationships, which of course also comes in handy later when issues arise, which they inevitably will when you're talking about working with other humans. A lot of times people think about these as icebreakers. That's actually one of the ways I like to use them with my classes, is at the beginning of classes, where you can ask some kind of community building questions and help people get to know each other. So I brought a sample script that I thought I would go through with you just to show you what this could look like, since we don't have the opportunity to do practice today together in this webinar format. So here is a sample script. I hope folks can see it. Okay, I'm going to make it just a little bit bigger. Okay, and Madison's going to make these slides and resources available for you. So you're welcome to take this and modify this script to fit whatever setting that you are in, but hopefully it'll be a good launch pad for you. So it starts with a little bit of background of circles that we just went through together, and then it jumps into the script. So you're going to start by introducing the circle, and it gives some examples of how you might do that. I usually just say, welcome to our circle. And often the person who facilitates the circle is called the keeper of the circle. And you explain that circles is a name given to this process of this practice of restorative justice, and that they are an Indigenous practice. And you explain why we form a circle. So there are a couple of reasons why forming a circle really helps, and taking turns and using a talking piece really helps. The circle format helps so that we can see each other. You can see every face in a circle. It's a pretty miraculous thing, actually. So you can see everyone, and the talking piece allows every voice to also be heard and every ear to really hear. I often will go through some underlying principles or values of restorative circles the first time, or maybe the first couple of times we meet. So I've introduced a few of them here for you. You might share that in circles, leadership and power are shared. So you're trying to introduce some equality into the circle, some equity into the circle. Participants have direct visual contact with each other. Peace building is the focus. Interconnectedness of all participants is encouraged. Respect and accountability are required. Participation by everyone is necessary, and inclusion and mutual responsibility in the circle are indispensable. Yep, you want me to make it a little bigger. Okay. I'm having trouble doing that for some reason. It's as big as it's allowing me to zoom. So let me see if I can widen it a bit and see if that makes a difference. Your eyes must be the same as mine. All right. So after you've done kind of that welcome and opening, you're going to introduce whatever guidelines, or sometimes people call these norms. I actually like to call them invitations for engagement that you're using. Our next practice, I'm going to talk a little bit about why you might want to create these guidelines together, especially if you're going to continue to meet. But for the sake of this exercise, we're introducing a few that are pretty common. So these guidelines are to listen when others speak and to use the talking stick, to speak with honesty and from the heart, to use words that are respectful and non-offensive. And that's one that often gets a lot of discussion, because what's respectful and non-offensive might vary between me and you. While everyone's encouraged to speak, no one's required to, and what's said in circle stays in circle. I'm going to try your trick of typing in a bigger number and see if that works. Nope, looks like it's defaulting to 200 is the largest. Sorry, folks in the chat. All right, and then I like to ask if there's anything people want to change or add to the guidelines before we get started, and then we open the circle. And so I like to open the circle by sometimes we have something that you might center on. I've got a candle that has no flame so that I don't get fired when I do these at the school. So you might have something that you center on, and maybe take a few deep breaths, and then you say a few words of opening. So I like to open by talking a little bit more about the talking piece and how you can talk or pass. So I often will pass to the left and tell people that when you have the talking piece, you can respond to the initial prompt. So every time it comes back to me, the keeper of the circle, I'll introduce another prompt. And so you can respond to that, or you can respond to something else that you heard someone say before you in the circle, or you can introduce a new idea. You can speak when you have the piece, or you can pass. And really important that folks know that they have the ability to pass, and that it will come to them more than once. So if they have nothing to say that time, that's okay. They can pass. And if they're still kind of forming their thoughts, and maybe they'll have something to add the next time. And this last point in this paragraph here, when you're not speaking, it's important to remain present and really kind of lean into listening. And I frequently will tell people that this is a problem that I have. When I'm not talking, I am pretty frequently thinking about what I might say when the talking piece comes to me. And so I try to add that piece of vulnerability and tell them that that's something I have to really lean into. And then I say we're opening the circle, and then you're going to ask some questions. Remember, this is a community building circle. And so the kinds of questions that you ask should do that. Try to build community. So I put some sample ideas, but honestly, if you were to Google icebreaker questions, you're going to come up with lists of thousands of potential questions that you could use. And so you might be thinking about your audience and try to match them that way. But there are some sample prompts here. And then before you close, you might take another round to do some sort of a closing round. And so I like to ask about takeaways, maybe something they heard someone say that they're taking out of circle, something that they learned about someone else. Again, if your focus is on community building, a short phrase that summarizes their experience. And then you will note that you're closing the circle. So that is a script for what a circle could look like. I'm going to go back to my slide decks. And as I do, ask, are there any questions that folks have about that? Besides everyone trying to fix I tried all the things you suggested I did try and they did not work. So sorry about that. You're welcome, Sue. Yeah, Madison will share the script. You know, how big should the circles be is a really good question. If a circle gets to be more than about 25 people, I think it can be challenging. I think it depends on the intent of your circle, right? If you're trying to do some community building, if you get really big, it can be harder and folks don't have quite as much of a chance to talk, but I think you have to adapt it for your community. I saw that Abigail was on. I'm curious if Abigail, what would be the largest circle that you've ever run? If you're still here. 85, yeah. That's a big circle. All right, any other questions? Yeah, 3 hours. I believe that. Yeah, I believe it. All right. So that is a little bit about community building circles. Again, I really like to see these as a foundation, especially if you're working with people over time. So I think about work teams. I think about groups that might be meeting over time. And I'm thinking about social service settings, certainly in classrooms. If any of you work in schools, classes or groups within schools could get started with community building circles. And again, they create this really beautiful foundation where if there are issues later and you need to come back to circle to talk about it, this format is very familiar to everyone. So really quickly, I wanted to talk about the building of norms or guidelines. So you can actually run a circle, very similar to the script that I just shared with you, to build those norms or guidelines. And I like to do this, especially if it's a group that's going to meet repeatedly over time. I like it because it can create a sense of belonging and connectedness when the group has created their own guidelines. And our point here, right, is to try to create a space where folks can come together to build and maintain relationships. And so having some ownership over the guidelines really can make a difference if you need to kind of come back to them at any point, remind people about them. It can be really useful when people come up with them together. So you would run a norm setting circle in a really similar way to that community building circle. It's just that when you ask the questions, instead of asking kind of get to know you questions and prompts, you'd ask things about the kind of environment that they want to create or the kind of guidelines that they'd like to see. So I often will ask questions like, if you could describe the community that you want to try to build together, what would it look like? What would it feel like? I like to ask, what do you need from our community in order to make this be successful? Those are some good prompts to get people really thinking about the environment that they want to create. And so as we're in circle, I would have a notepad, right, and be writing down the things that I hear, and I try to kind of organize them into the themes that I'm hearing. Sometimes people will stand with a flip chart. I don't like to leave circle when I'm in circle, and it feels a bit like stepping out of it to be on a flip chart, and so I like to just take notes on my lap. So you'll take several rounds and get people's ideas, and then when it comes back to me at some point, I might just summarize what I think I've heard and how I've tried to organize what I've heard, and then take another round or two to collect maybe anything I got wrong, anything that's missing, anything anybody might want to add. So again, really similar framework. It's just that the rounds of the circle have to do with building these guidelines. And then those would become the guidelines that you would come back to every time you're in circle, or when I teach a class on restorative practices, we actually use them as the guidelines for our whole class, whether we're in circle or out of circle. And you can list your guidelines as kind of a bulleted list, like in the script that I shared with you. Or one thing I like to do is make it kind of a statement of community. So I might start it, "In this community we believe," and then write a little paragraph that summarizes what came out of our community building circle. And I still would take those things away, write it up, bring it back, and get some more feedback on it, because it really is important to me that this be something that is a shared document, that they're shared principles, so we can keep coming back to them. And some people like to have folks even sign them, like as a commitment to those guidelines. I've never done that, but that's pretty common. If you have questions about that, feel free to leave them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm hoping you can just take a minute to jot down. You can jot it down on your own. You could write it in the chat if you want to, but I'm just curious if you can imagine using either of these practices in your work, and if so, how? Like, what would be the settings where you think you might be using them? Just take a minute to think about its application in your practice. Yeah, Cindy, I've used them quite a lot in workplaces with teams or groups. I think they can be really, really useful. Small groups with students for sure. Schools, community groups. Yeah, churches, I could see them working there too. Teens and families. Yep. They can be really useful in family settings. And I'm actually going to talk about restorative conversations in just a minute, which also can be really useful with families. Elementary school classes, community theater group. Oh, I love that. Volunteer groups, lots of schools. I like that people are thinking about professional and personal uses too. So hopefully folks can go through and just skim through the chat and read some of the uses, and maybe it'll spark your ideas about some of the other ways that you might use practices. There was a question in the chat about whether the guidelines ever evolve over time. My first thought was, what doesn't evolve over time? Certainly your group might evolve over time. What people want out of it might evolve over time. Things might come up that maybe you hadn't anticipated, and that may want you to change them over time. When I teach, we build community norms at the beginning of class, and then I always come back to them halfway through the semester, and we look at them again just to see, is this still working for us? Is there anything we might want to change or modify? So I like the idea of coming back to them again. If they can be kind of living, breathing documents, that helps keep it real. And I think that also helps people maybe adhere to them a little more, because they feel that ownership. I like Jennifer's idea about creating policies or procedures. I think that's I think that's an interesting idea. I don't know if you're meaning to use a circle for creating policies or procedures, or if there are policies and procedures for implementing. So if you want to clarify that, I think I assumed the former, but maybe you mean the latter. Yeah, Fran, I can send some resources to Madison to share out about use of restorative practices in workplaces. Very common. It's actually one of my favorite places to use them. Madison, if you could make a note, I'll get that to you. Other questions? I'm just going to pause here. Other questions or things that people want to share? I caught everything in the chat. So I think one of the reasons when there are lots of professional reasons that you're reflecting on, but some of them are personal too. And I like that because like I said in the beginning, I think once you start using these kind of practices, you're going to start to see ways that you can use them in your professional and your private life. And they just become kind of a way of being instead of a practice that you're turning on and turning off. Yeah, incredibly useful for handling conflicts as they arise. So we're going to kind of get into more intervention focused strategies in just a second. Are we ready? I'm seeing the chat slow down, so I'm going to take that as a yes, we're ready. Okay, there's a question in the chat about modifying it. So, that's interesting that you bring up modification. So the last time I taught this as a class in school, there were a lot of people who worked with little kids, and some who worked with kids who had various learning disabilities. And so we spent quite a lot of time talking about what they would modify. And I loved how kind of organically the ideas for how they could be modified were raised out of the experience, right? We practiced it, people experienced it, and then they had some ideas about ways that obviously your language would need to change for how you're introducing it. We practiced doing things like using our bodies. So when we opened and closed circles, we did things with our bodies so that things would be a little bit more physical, because they thought that for small ones that might be really useful. We talked about the idea of putting fidgets at all the spaces by all the chairs, so people had things that they could touch and feel during the time. So those might be things that you might consider, but certainly language of how you're introducing it is one thing I'd be thinking a lot about. You might think about chair placement. You're talking about the kind of stress that could be caused because of the social nature of it. And certainly stressing the idea of passing could be really important there too. And Julie notes that you used yoga meditation with autism groups, so something physical for their bodies. Appreciate that. Okay. All right, so let's talk about these three practices that kind of fall in that middle bucket that are a little more intervention focused. And I say a little more because I really like this bucket of practices, because I think, yes, they're intervention. Yes, something has happened that's causing us to kind of come in and explore that. But if we can catch things early, it often can stop it from kind of bubbling to become a more major incident where maybe we have to, at some point, we may not be able to think about restorative practices anymore, right? So I think about it as maybe early intervention or secondary prevention even. So we're going to focus here a little bit on this middle bucket. So the first thing in that middle bucket is restorative conversations. These are my favorite. I really like to think about restorative conversations. So they are used with, I say here, 2 to 3 people, and that's because you may have a restorative conversation directly with someone. I've had restorative conversations with people who I feel have impacted me negatively. I've also had restorative conversations where I've been told I have negatively impacted someone. And so it may just be the 2 of you who are having that restorative conversation. It may be 3 people if you are facilitating a restorative conversation between 2 others. So actually this next week, I'm going to be facilitating a restorative conversation between a faculty member and a student because something has come up and it has left some really hard feelings and people are unsure how to move that forward. So as I mentioned, these are generally used before an issue becomes super serious, right? Too serious for this to be an option anymore. So just a few examples. Maybe a social worker is struggling with what they observe to be disruptive behaviors in a group. Maybe someone's coming late or doing unrelated things during a group time. I've used it when I've seen things brewing between employees. We've used that here. I've used that in other places that I've worked. I've also used them when I've worried about someone's work performance, to have a direct conversation about work performance and how that might be impacting me or other people. Or maybe you're you're facilitating a conversation between a couple of people. Like I think about parents and teenagers or couples, where someone has felt hurt by something that someone else has done. Between a staff person and a student, yes, Jessica says, yeah. So again, you might serve as a facilitator in that space, or you might be someone who just needs to have that direct conversation with someone else. And restorative conversations there are different models for it, but my favorite is this kind of 4-phased model. What I like about it is I find these 4 phases really easy to remember. So you're gonna move through talking about the problem or the issue, the impact that problem or issue has had on someone else, where you wanna be, like what is a desired state, and then how do you get there? And I find that just really easy to tuck in my brain and move through it in a pretty natural way with folks. So you're going to talk to people about the first is the issue or problem. So what's happening? If it's someone that you need to talk to because of a conflict that you're having directly, you might say, I'm noticing this thing, right? I'm noticing that this thing is happening. If you're facilitating between a couple of people, you might say, I understand there's been an issue. Can you describe what's going on? Tell me what's happening. Tell whoever else they're talking to what's happening. What's the problem? So that's the first phase. The second phase is the impact. So what's the effect that this problem is having on others? So whether it's that person directly, whether it's the larger environment, often that's missed. Like I can talk to someone about the impact it's having on me, but it might also be having an impact on our larger community. And that's important to note too. What would it look like if the problem didn't exist is kind of the third phase. So you might, it's kind of that desired state phase. You're trying to think about, sometimes I'll say, if I were to wave a magic wand and the problem didn't exist, what would that look like? Describe that, right? So you're trying to figure out, where are we trying to go? What are we shooting or striving for? What would it look like if things were better? And then the fourth phase is, how do we get there? So if that's what better looks like, how do we get from here to there? How do we move to that place? So hopefully that makes sense. And when you're facilitating a restorative conversation, you're asking these questions of both people involved. It isn't just that one person caused the harm and one person felt the harm. Often there are hard feelings that are felt kind of on all sides, right? We all caused the harm. We all felt the harm. And so having a chance to really explore that is important. And like I said, exploring the impact that's had on the larger environment, because we can fix this thing between us, but if we never resolve the larger environmental problems, we're only kind of halfway there. Just making sure I didn't miss anything. Madison's just prompting me to put questions in the chat. So does that make sense? Do you have questions about that? Makes sense. It's hard when I don't have the nonverbal feedback. I can't see you all nodding. Like, I get it, Bar. Thanks, Zaina. Okay. Yeah, Hala, I like the steps too. I really think that they're easy to tuck away, and I do use them a lot in all facets of my life. So one thing that I often get questions about is preparation for these restorative conversations. So I want to just talk about that for a minute. It's quite important that people go into this restorative conversation knowing what to expect. So if I'm facilitating a restorative conversation between two people, I'm first going to meet with those two people separately. These are called lots of things: a pre-meeting, a screening, as an assessment, an intake, an orientation. You can call it whatever you want, but it's basically like a chance to do a couple of things. The first is to figure out if the person who caused the harm is willing to accept some responsibility. Because if they aren't, putting them into a room with someone who feels like they have been harmed can actually do more harm. So we're not going to move forward with that. The second thing that you're kind of screening for is the person who felt the harm even interested in doing this? It is perfectly okay if they're not interested, if this isn't the right time, if that isn't something that they're interested in doing. And we need to know that before we put folks in a room together. So it's a little bit like medical triage, right? Do we go this way or do we go that way? So Fran is asking in the chat, what if someone in the conversation isn't very self-aware, or they have a hard time articulating either what they did or maybe what they need or want or are feeling? And this pre-screening is actually really helpful to help you do some of that. So I mentioned that I'm in the process of helping to facilitate a restorative conversation right now, and I did get the sense that one of the people involved, I just wasn't sure with the way that they were articulating their role in it, that they really understood the impact that their behavior had had on other people. And so I just said it, right? I noted it. I was very kind of frank about it because we had taken time to build some relationship. And so I just said, here's what I think I'm hearing, and here's what I'm worried about. And I just named it. And, we were able to get some clarity on it. And I left feeling really good about moving it forward. I want to make sure there's lots of stuff in the chat. Let me make sure I read through it. Brenda asks, when you have a restorative conversation with yourself and someone else, maybe it's, does the other person see you too close to the problem because of your profession? I'm not quite sure I understand, but I will say with that I am quite aware of my position. And so I often will name that too if I'm having a restorative conversation with someone, and try to show some kind of vulnerability in that space, which sometimes can help to level the field a little bit. Actually, I had an issue with a student not long ago where the student felt harmed by me. And the student really wasn't sure they wanted to meet with me about it. They were quite worried about it. And now I'm so much more aware of other people in the school that facilitate these kind of conversations. And I probably would have pulled one of them in to facilitate it. I think that could have helped a lot. In the end, the person met with me. We had a great conversation. I really was incredibly remorseful that I had hurt this person. It obviously, it wasn't my intent, but it was clearly the impact. And the student left feeling really good. And, we've done independent studies since then. It's been really a positive relationship since then. So I think it's quite possible to be involved and still make everyone feel comfortable. Yeah, that imbalance of power. Hopefully I spoke to that for you, Brenda. Mm-hmm. If you're worried about it, having another person involved can be really useful. Okay, so you're doing this kind of triage, right? To figure out, does this make sense? Or maybe would a different route be better to go? And a lot of times I use those same 4 questions in this pre-meeting. So I let the person know, what's going on, and that I'm wondering if maybe coming together for a restorative conversation makes sense. It might not, and that's perfectly okay. And I will ask them the same questions, like what happened from your perspective? What happened? How did that impact you? How do you think that it impacted other people? How do you think it impacted the environment or the larger team? What do you want from this? If you could imagine a perfect resolution, what would that look like? And then how do we get there? And I start by talking about restorative practices as really centering relationships. I often will say, 2 people are talking, but your relationship is going to sit at the center of the table. And the person's not the problem, right? The problem is the problem. So we're going to talk about that as well, separate from the person. And with that framing, it can really help people to understand what to expect, which I think is useful, right? That's one of the reasons we're doing this. We want to make sure that everybody knows what to expect. And it helps you get a good sense of whether everybody's ready to engage. How does it work when both people think the other person has caused the harm? I mean, honestly, Catherine, that's probably true, right? If both people are feeling harm has been caused on all sides, and that both things can be true at the same time. And sometimes I'll name that, and it's actually pretty common for hurt to be felt all around. And that can be a good part of this pre-meeting too, to let folks know that that's often the case. And sometimes, and with this, the one that I'm in the middle of right now, I ended up talking to people about what will it be like to hear that. Like they're probably going to tell you some ways that they feel like you harmed them. What's that going to be like? And I want people to think about that in advance and not be blindsided by it in the moment. Julie said, how to have the other person accept responsibility. I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Maybe you could just type it another way. Sonia, I want to make sure that I'm understanding. It's so hard not to be able to talk to you. I want to make sure I'm understanding your question properly too. Sometimes a restorative process isn't the way to go. You're going to get through this and you're going to think, for one of these reasons, this isn't the route that we go. And our organizations, when you think about it from an organizational level, our organizations have other avenues to go. So with this conflict between a student and a faculty member, we have a grievance procedure. It's formal, it's, I don't know, punitive, but we have it. And so if this didn't work, that's the other route. That's also everybody's option. And so it's good to know what the alternatives are if this isn't the right choice. Let me see. Yeah, dealing with resistance or lack of awareness. I often will just name it. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I'm worried about. Maybe I'm misinterpreting this, right? So help me understand. George asks, does accepting responsibility have to come first? I think that it's hard to have true understanding of what's happened before you've heard it from the person who you've harmed. I think you can understand it maybe on some level, but what I'd want to see is that people were at least open to hearing that and at least open to taking some responsibility. They might not fully understand why, they might not fully understand what, because that's what you're doing together, right, as a dyad. But I do want them to give some thought to it, and at least it's an openness, I think, that I'm usually looking for. Did I miss any other questions?
I think you got them all, Barb.
Did I? Okay. Well done. All right, let me just make sure I didn't miss anything I wanted to say here. Well, I do want to say just one more. So certainly this lets people know what to expect in the time that we're going to come together. It also helps us to build some rapport, build some engagement. Again, I keep coming back to the situation I'm in the middle of now. And I'll say the student, as you can imagine, and this goes back to somebody's question about power, felt that power imbalance and was nervous about the idea of coming together. And the student left this meeting saying, I trust you and I'm going to trust the process. If it goes like this, right, if this is really what I can expect, I'm feeling good about it. So still some reticence, but at least a little maybe more openness to moving forward with it. Okay, I think we're pausing for another poll, Madison. So I want you to think again about ways that you might use this. So I think you can check all that apply. So could you see yourself using restorative conversations with coworkers or employees when work-related things come up, with client pairs like couples or parents and children, in your personal life if you have caused harm to someone else, or if you, I'm sorry, if you have felt hurt, or if you have caused hurt or harm. Yeah, Ashley, you can pick all of the above for sure. Oh, it does. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, it looks like the poll's only allowing you to choose one. Yeah, so maybe I'll end it then if it's only allowing you to pick one. Interestingly, the results were pretty even throughout those options, which makes me think you probably are imagining yourself using them all. I'm just going to skim through the chat. It looks like most people have said all could be beneficial. Deanna talks about experience with couples and finding this really useful. Yeah, I'll tell you, I have used these in all of these situations. My partner will sometimes say, "Don't social work me." I definitely use them in my personal life too. I definitely use them with my children. I've used them with friends when I've had conflicts with friends, and then in work settings that I've been talking about mostly today. Dawn is laughing at my comment because probably one of Dawn's partners, Dawn has social worked one of their partners. All right, awesome. Yeah, don't social work me. I think we all get that. That's what happens. All right. So the last practice, actually, this is two that I wanted to talk about. We can talk about them together or separately, depending on your questions in the chat. But restorative conversations are then the basis for coming together with either a small group or a large group to have restorative conversations. So remember, the restorative conversations are meant to be just a couple of people, but sometimes it's not just a couple of people, right? Sometimes it's we've got to get more people together because harm has been felt more broadly. So it might be a small group like a work team or maybe a family unit, or it might be a larger group like a larger work team, or maybe a whole office up to 85 people, as Abigail has reminded us that they've done them. That sounds pretty intimidating to me. So with group restorative conversation, you're going to use that same 4-question format, but you're going to combine it with a circle. So here's where we start to put some things together. So I have, let me get this down again. Again, if we were together, I would do a little role playing with you. So I've got a role play here that actually I've used with some students in the class. And so I thought maybe I would just walk you through this so that you can see what it would look like and how we kind of move through those 4 phases, but in a group setting. So we're going to come together in circle like you learned about in the beginning. Here's the scenario. This is a workplace. It's a community center, a nonprofit organization. And our team has gathered in a circle with a facilitator to discuss some conflict that the team's been having related to workload. So in particular, issues have been raised about a team member named Alex, who people believe is not doing their share of the work. So in our circle example, we've got the facilitator, and then we've got 3 other employees, Maya, David, and Carmen, and then we've got Alex, who's the person that folks are frustrated about in this moment. So we are going to open the circle in a similar way that we described before, right? We're going to describe the background of circles. We're going to describe the talking piece. We're going to describe how it all works. And then we're going to open our circle. So this role play starts with us opening our circle. And so I'm going to note kind of the movement through these 4 phases, how the facilitator does that. So the facilitator is going to open by welcoming everyone. So I'm just going to read this. Welcome again, everyone. As I mentioned, this restorative circle has been called to address the workload distribution issue that's been impacting the team. I know we've all met, but how about we begin by saying our names and sharing a little about the problem or issue that you think brought us here today. So we're starting with the issue or the problem, right? That first phase. So Maya introduces himself, David does, Carmen does, each of them lay out what they think the problem is, what brought them here today. They're feeling stressed out and resentful. They believe that Alex isn't doing their fair share of the work. Alex is also in our circle, right? So Alex has a chance to say, I'm Alex, and how Alex is feeling, a little defensive and maybe a little ashamed. And Alex shares that they didn't know that people thought that they weren't pulling their weight. So then we're back to the facilitator. We've made a round of the circle. You could do one, or sometimes you do more than one round. I'll say to that facilitating restorative conversations is a little science, which we're talking about today, and a whole lot art. This is where our kind of broader social work skills come into play. You got to read the room. You got to figure out what it is that people need in that moment. Are they done? Do they have more to say? Sometimes I'll do an extra round of a circle just to see if anyone has anything to add, and no one does, and that's good. Then we know we're ready to move on. So we've identified the problem. People have had a chance to talk about the problem. Now we're back to the facilitator, and the facilitator says, thank you for sharing. I wonder if in this next round, people might share a little more about how this problem of work distribution is impacting them. Maya, can you share how you've been affected by the workload issue? So now we're moving into impact, right? And everybody has a chance to talk about how they are feeling impacted. They're feeling like it's not fair. They're struggling to keep up. Their mental health is impacted. They're worried about their evaluation, their performance reviews, right? Because they're doing their job plus someone else's. And then Alex also gets a chance to reflect on the impact, that Alex can understand how frustrating that might be. He talks about being sorry and honestly that this was sort of news to him. And Alex is saying, I thought I was doing everything that I needed to do. So we might take a round or two on the impact, see if anyone has anything more to add. And then the facilitator moves us to the third phase by saying something like, it's important to also think about how we can repair the harm and find a way forward. What would it look like if this problem didn't exist? And then we're going to do another round where we're thinking about that kind of desired state, our third phase. People have some ideas about what that could look like, including Alex, right? Alex has got some ideas about what that could look like. And then when we're back to the facilitator says, these are all great ideas. Maybe we can go around one more time and add any other thoughts you have about how we can move to that place where we all feel better about things. So again, now we're in that fourth phase of how do we move towards that desired state? And everyone has a chance to weigh in about that. The facilitator does some wrap up at the end where they try to summarize what they have heard, might be some next steps. They take another round to see if anything was missed or if people have anything they want to add, and then the facilitator wraps it up. So I'm going to check the chat, type in your questions after we just went through that. Okay, anything coming up for folks? So hopefully you were able to see these kind of four phases as we moved through. Dawn asks, what was the role of Alex's supervisor in the process? You know, depending on the relationships, the supervisor could serve as the facilitator of the circle, right? Or Alex's supervisor could be there to hear about the impact, because part of the issue here might be Alex. Part of it might be a supervision issue. Like, is anyone, because Alex's supervisor may also be other people's supervisor. So maybe there's actually some hurt and hard feelings about the supervisor too that could surface out of this. Zainab is asking about books or resources with sort of scripts for different scenarios. if anyone knows of any, I would love to see them. I have gone on a search for them and not found anything that I have loved. One of these little books is about restorative activities, which is, I don't seem to have it here. Oh, here. The little book of restorative teaching tools. It's got games and activities and simulations. So it's got a few things in it, but I didn't think it was excellent. Do you ever co-facilitate with a larger group? Yes, I'm so glad you asked that, Barb. Yes, I do. It is great too, because it's often nice to have one person who kind of keeps the talking going and one person who's watching for the nonverbals. I find that to be really useful. Once the groups get to be over about, I don't know, maybe 15 people, I find it really difficult to do all of that. And it can be really helpful to have a second facilitator there, and also to kind of help with the prep and the debrief and the follow-up that needs to happen. Meryl is saying it seems like Alex would feel attacked by this. I don't know what other people think, but I do think in a situation like this, that prep becomes really important, because it is very likely that someone in a group situation could feel attacked. So spending some time making sure Alex knows what to expect and that Alex is really ready for that, I think is really important. Yeah, so Fran is getting down to business, thinking about what are we going to do after, right? The next meeting to kind of set up balanced distribution of tasks. How do we come together to really support this team in playing out whatever is the plan that people come to? Kathleen asked a question about recommendations for the role of race or ethnicity or culture in this method of resolution. And I think, Kathleen, I think that's very situational, depending on, you talk about culture. I mean, culture is individual people, but culture is also the culture that is created within a workplace. We all have our own, and sometimes within a workplace, there are different cultures that exist. And so paying attention to all of that is really important, knowing as much as you can about it. If you've got specific questions related to that, why don't you put them in the chat and we'll see if we can speak to them. Yeah, Fran is also asking about the easels and markers to make lists. I think I mentioned at the beginning with guidelines, I don't like to leave circle to get up and be on an easel. I don't like that. Other people really like it because everybody then can see it. I tend to take notes on my lap and then just share out verbally, but I know that doesn't work for everyone. Yeah, so Summer, I've actually been in circles where the talking piece is a ball that can be tossed across the circle and can be tossed to other people. I have never done that. I like to go one direction or the other. I have found that people like to know when it's coming to them. They have just a minute to put their thoughts together. And so that I do tend to go around the circle, and sometimes I'll start going left and then the next round I'll go right. Okay. Did I get them all, Madison? What questions did I miss?
I think you got them.
Okay. All right. Well, two final questions, and then we'll leave the last time for more questions and discussion. So when you think about your likelihood of trying to use each of these practices, we're curious about that. Looks like lots of likely and very likely coming in. A couple people don't see it. Looks like just one for each don't see themselves as maybe using these, but people are seeing some value. That makes me really happy. I just think there is such value in these practices for so many different settings. I'm going to stop the poll because I think I've got most of you now. So it looks like more than half of you are likely to use it. Another 42% are very likely to use it. So that's terrific. I also, if you're interested in using it, just want to note that this is very brief. We've been talking for an hour and 15 minutes, right? This is very brief. This is something that people spend a lifetime practicing and learning, and we're still learning. And so you know, at the school, we teach a 2-day class on this. I'm also planning in September to do a 1-day intensive where it'll be very similar to the content that we just covered, but we'll have lots of chances to practice and role play and dig in on the issues that you're really interested in. As an example, the last time I taught this class, because we had space to do it, we sort of build in space to these workshops, I had a lot of students who were interested in the intersection between abolition and restorative practices. And so we really dug into that. So between session 1 and session 2, I got a bunch of resources together and brought that forward. And one of the students out of that class is doing an independent study on that topic right now. So there's lots of chance when we've got more time together to really dig in and practice. So if you're interested in that, in knowing more about the September session, you can share. Madison put a link to a form in the chat. So people are putting their information in the chat. I think we can probably collect it that way too, Madison, can we?
We can, and I'll send it to you, Barb.
Okay, great. Oh, good. A student who took the class in the spring mentioned that they liked it. That makes me really happy. Thank you. Yeah, so you can either type your information in the chat if you are comfortable doing that, or fill out a form if you don't want your email out there, and we'll get in touch with you about the September session. Other questions? I don't think I missed any questions. I think everyone's just putting. What other questions do folks have about restorative practices as we wrap up? We saved a little bit of time for the end. Oh, Sue, I'm glad you can see ways to use this in supervision. Yeah, I've used it with employees a lot. And last year, Sue Crabb used to work on our field, was a member of our field faculty. And last year I had a field student that I used this with too, and it worked really well. Brenda's asking when it might not be appropriate. And for me, you remember on that kind of pre-screen slide where we talked about really making sure that people are open to hearing what they've done that's caused harm, and that the person who feels harm wants to engage. I think if those things are not in place, this is not, it really isn't the appropriate route to go, at least in that moment. I'm not saying never, but I think that more harm can be caused by bringing people together if someone is insisting that they did nothing wrong, or is, you know, angry, or certainly if the person who feels like they've been harmed just doesn't want to be in a room with the person, for example, who caused the harm. I think we are not going to force that to happen. So those are instances where I really would step away. Yeah, Catherine asked a question about in circles. What if someone chooses not to speak? I mean, one of our principles of restorative practice is that participation really does matter. And so I think if this was an ongoing group that I was working with, I think I would do nothing in the beginning, just allow them to pass, because we have said passing is okay. And I think at some point I would check in with that person just to figure out why. There's probably a really good reason why, and I don't want to assume what that is, and guessing about it isn't going to help us very much. So I think I might just check in with them separately to see if this is something that they want to do, something that they feel engaged in. Why is it that they are quiet? And if they want to remain quiet, would they be willing to share that reason with the group? I think sometimes that's just enough. So other people in the group aren't wondering, why is this person not participating or talking? Because otherwise it really can, as you say, impact the dynamic. Charlotte, a conversation could go off the rails for a million reasons. So how I would handle it would be different in absolutely every case. I'd be glad to talk to you more if you've got some specific worries about that, or a specific maybe scenario about how it might go off the rails. And I would also say, come to the workshop in September, because that's a big thing that we will talk about, because we want to make sure that everybody really feels prepared, in not just when it's going well, but in times when maybe it's not going quite so well. I agree, Abigail, that power dynamics is huge. Yeah, Randy, so use in the legal system often falls in that kind of third bucket that we just didn't have a chance to get to today. If folks are not familiar with the Dispute Resolution Center in Ann Arbor, they've got some really good resources available about how they're trying to integrate this into the legal system. But it's often, and I think this is one of the connections between abolition movements, right? We're trying to really think about what are ways that we can it's along the lines of diversion, right? How do we think about this as an avenue for peacemaking instead of a more punitive method? So some of that work is happening in Washtenaw County and around the country. So Summer, you have a good question about how to build this into a community's culture. One way I think that works really well is just to hold regular community building circles. Start to build it in that way. People, as I mentioned, get used to the format. They get to know each other a little bit. I went through a train the trainer workshop a couple of years ago where it was all focused on how do you build this into a culture. And so it brought us through, actually, if you want to send me an email, I'll put you in touch with this organization. You might be interested in it, but you build your own organizational plan for how you're going to integrate these practices. So you think about who are the stakeholders that need to be involved? How do you get other champions involved? And we're actually going through some of this right now as a school to try to figure out how we can build more restorative practices into the school. And part of it is just figuring out who we have in our system who is interested in this, who already knows about it. Some of those folks are on this Zoom meeting today. And then how do we start talking about it to others and kind of increase that group? Cindy asked a question about whether the facilitator always needs to be a neutral person or whether they could also be a member of the group. I have seen this done both ways. I've seen it be an external person. I've also seen internal people facilitate. We're talking about something that is often used within communities. And so a community can certainly run their own circle often, and that can work really well. But I just think roles need to be really clear. Everybody needs to know the role that the circle keeper is playing in that moment. There's a question from Genevieve about schools and when might restorative circles be used instead of more punitive measures like suspensions. So here's what I know about what's being done in school systems, and some of you might know more than I do because this is not my practice area. But restorative conversations between restorative justice practitioners and students are often used as kind of a starting place when things have maybe blown up in a class. And then sometimes restorative practice facilitators will come into a classroom and kind of facilitate a re-entry into the classroom if a student's needed to take a break or be out for a minute. I think that I've seen restorative conversations be facilitated between teachers and students, between students together, in small groups. Actually, restorative conversation was done in my daughter's school when there was really awful, like, girl bullying stuff happening. They pulled this group of girls together to run a restorative conversation. So those are some examples. Yeah, Brenda asked a question about whether it could be done online. Yes, I have absolutely run restorative circles online. There is a way to kind of pull people's boxes in a certain order, or you can type in the chat the order that you're going to go in. And then we usually when I pass, because you can't pass a physical thing. Oh, by the way, this is the talking piece that I like to use. I like to use a little hourglass, so that this is my talking piece that I bring with me. On when you're online, I usually have people just say, I am now going to pass to Madison. So there's some kind of cue that you're ready to pass to another person. But yes, I've seen them be very effective online. Fran, yes, I think my email might be on the first slide of the presentation. So if that is shared, you will have it. Buy-in from school communities. You're not alone, Hillary. School communities are not the only ones that have trouble doing buy-in. This is the sort of thing that like sounds good in practice, but when you're actually in a situation where you're worried about something, often our first gut instinct is to go to some kind of punitive measure, and schools are pretty notorious for doing this. Like, yeah, restorative practices sounds great, but also we're going to suspend you for swearing in class or whatever it is. So again, Hillary, I'm glad to connect you with that group that did the training that I referenced, where you build your own kind of organizational plan to think about who you might want to have as a part of it and what are some restorative approaches that you might start to integrate.
Barb, there was a question in here from Summer, and she asked if you could, sorry, I'm trying to find it now, say a little more about how to build these into communities.
Yeah, I think I touched on that. I think I touched on that a little bit, and I'm glad to, like I said, put you in touch with the organization where their whole training is about that. So how do you learn about them, and then how do you build a plan to integrate them into whatever community you are a part of? Did we do it?
I think we got all the questions.
Did we? All right. Well, I am glad to talk to people further. Madison will share my slides that have my email address. There are other people at the school that also have expertise in this area, and so glad to connect with anyone further. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you, Barb, so much for this wonderful presentation. And thank you to everyone for attending the first session of this year's Building Healthy, Strong Communities Conference. We hope to see you at another session over the next couple of days. The second session, titled Getting Out the Vote, a Social Work Call to Action, will begin at 1 p.m. Eastern today. In the next 1 to 2 weeks, those who have met the attendance requirements will receive an email from our continuing education office. Any questions regarding CE should be directed to ssw.conted@umich.edu. It's also on the screen right now. Thank you for attending and have a wonderful day.